A racist cop pulls over a pregnant black woman on a deserted road. The cop looks at her with suspicion and authority. He accuses her of driving recklessly without any real evidence. Angela Williams, visibly pregnant and nervous, tries to stay calm and explain her situation. The officer dismisses her words. He threatens her with a ticket and begins escalating the situation. Angela feels cornered and afraid. She knows she must act fast to protect herself and her unborn baby. Little does the officer know who her husband is. Jonathan Williams is one of the most famous civil rights lawyers in the country. Angela calls Jonathan as the officer continues his harsh behavior. What happens when her husband arrives will leave the officer speechless. The events that follow will shake the community and spark a national conversation. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge injustice and inspire change. Angela Williams is a strong and independent woman in her early 30s. She is married to Jonathan Williams, a well-known civil rights lawyer who has built a reputation for fighting against injustice and discrimination. Angela is in the final months of her pregnancy. She is looking forward to starting a new chapter of her life as a mother. She is also excited about the loving home she and Jonathan have built together. They live in a small but racially divided town. This town has a history of tension between law enforcement and minority communities. Stories of unfair treatment by the police are common. Angela is fully aware of the challenges people face every day in her community. Jonathan often works late nights, traveling across the country to defend those who have been wronged. Angela admires his dedication, but sometimes wishes he could be home more often. Despite his busy schedule, he always reminds Angela that she and their unborn child are his priority. On a quiet evening, Angela drives home after a checkup at the hospital. She is feeling tired but happy. She thinks about the nursery they have just finished decorating and the excitement of meeting their baby soon. The road is calm, with very few cars passing by, but Angela's peace is short-lived. In her rearview mirror, she sees flashing red and blue lights. A police car is following her. Her heart begins to race as she pulls over to the side of the road. The officer steps out of the car and approaches Angela's vehicle. His face shows suspicion. It is Officer Rick Marshall, a man known for targeting minorities. People in the community often share stories about his behavior. He is infamous for using his badge as a weapon against those he deems out of place. Angela takes a deep breath and rolls down her window. She hopes that staying calm will keep the situation under control, but deep inside, she feels uneasy. She knows the stories about Officer Marshall and prays that this will not be one of those moments. As the officer starts asking questions, Angela realizes this encounter is not going to be simple. She tries to explain that she is coming back from the hospital, but Officer Marshall is not interested in her explanation. Instead, he accuses her of reckless driving. The tension in the air grows thicker. Angela knows she needs to stay composed, not just for herself, but for the baby she is carrying. She has no idea how this encounter will escalate, but she knows one thing for sure. She's not going to let anyone treat her unfairly. Angela sits quietly in her car as Officer Rick Marshall looms outside. His gaze is cold and piercing, as if he is already judging her. She takes a deep breath and reminds herself to stay calm. Slowly, she rolls down her window. "License, registration," Officer Marshall says in a harsh tone. His voice carries no hint of politeness. Angela hands over her documents, her hands slightly trembling. She forces a calm tone as she asks, "Is there a problem, officer?" Marshall smirks. He looks over her paperwork but doesn't seem interested. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asks. Before Angela can respond, he continues, "You were speeding. That is reckless driving, especially for someone in your condition." Angela's confusion grows. She knows she was driving well within the speed limit. She calmly explains, "Officer, I was not speeding. I just came from the hospital and I am trying to get home." But Marshall is not listening. Instead, he leans closer to her car window, inspecting the interior. "This car seems a little too nice for someone like you," he says, his tone dripping with suspicion. Angela feels her heart sink. She has heard stories about Officer Marshall. She knows this is not about speeding. She maintains her composure and responds, "This is my car. My husband and I worked hard to afford it." Marshall scoffs, ignoring her words. He steps back and gestures toward her belly. "And what happens if you endanger that child? You should not even be on the road in your condition," he says. Angela feels her patience wearing thin. "Officer, I am not breaking any laws. I am just trying to get home safely." Marshall's face hardens. "Step out of the vehicle!" he orders. Angela freezes, unsure of what is happening. "Is that really necessary?" she asks. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" Marshall snaps, his voice rising. Angela knows she has no choice. Slowly, she unbuckles her seatbelt and steps out of the car. She feels the cool night air against her skin as Marshall continues to scrutinize her. By now, a few cars have slowed down to observe what is happening. A young man named Jason, who had been driving by, notices the situation. Something about the scene does not sit right with him. He pulls out his phone and starts recording from a distance. Marshall circles Angela's car, inspecting every inch of it. "Do you have any illegal items in this vehicle?" he asks. Angela's eyes widened in disbelief. "No, officer. I told you I just came from the hospital." Ignoring her response, Marshall begins searching her car without permission. Angela watches in shock as he rummages through her belongings. "You cannot do that," she says firmly, but Marshall does not care. Jason, still recording, steps a little closer. He knows he needs to capture everything. He can see the unease on Angela's face and the way Marshall is treating her. He has seen too many stories like this, and he refuses to stay silent. Marshall continues his search but finds nothing. Frustrated, he turns back to Angela. "You are lucky I did not find anything," he sneers. "But I am not done with you yet." Angela takes a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Officer, I have done nothing wrong. I would like to leave now," she says, but Marshall blocks her path. "Not so fast. I need to check a few more things," he says. The power dynamic is clear. Marshall enjoys holding control over the situation, while Angela feels trapped. The tension grows as a few more onlookers stop to watch. Jason quietly shares his recording with another passerby, saying, "We need to make sure she is safe. This is not right." Angela knows she must stay strong. She looks Marshall in the eye and says, "I am just trying to get home. Please let me go." But Marshall's smirk only deepens, showing no sign of backing down. The situation escalates quickly as Angela stands beside her car, her hands trembling slightly. Officer Marshall continues to question her, his tone growing harsher with every word. She tries to remain calm, knowing that reacting out of anger will only make things worse. Marshall looks at her, his gaze cold and piercing. "You are acting suspicious," he says. "I am going to need to detain you for further questioning." Angela's eyes widen in shock. "Detain me? For what?" "I have done nothing wrong," she says firmly, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. Marshall takes a step closer, towering over her. "Step over here," he orders, pointing to the side of the road. Angela hesitates for a moment, unsure of what to do, but she knows she has no choice. Slowly, she walks to where he directed her. By now, more people have stopped to watch. Some are recording the scene on their phones, whispering among themselves about the unnecessary aggression they are witnessing. Jason, who has been recording from the start, moves closer to capture everything clearly. Marshall pulls out a pair of handcuffs, holding them up as if to intimidate her. "Turn around," he says. Angela's heart races. "You cannot arrest me. I have done nothing wrong," she says again, her voice filled with disbelief. But Marshall ignores her. He grabs her arm and forces her to turn around, snapping the handcuffs on her wrists. Angela winces at the cold metal pressing against her skin. The crowd gasps. A woman in the crowd shouts, "She is pregnant! What are you doing?" But Marshall does not respond. His focus remains on Angela, his actions fueled by his authority and bias. Angela looks around at the growing crowd, feeling a mix of fear and anger. She knows she has done nothing wrong. She looks at Jason and nods slightly, silently thanking him for recording everything. Marshall leads Angela toward his patrol car, his grip firm on her arm. "You are under arrest for obstruction and resisting an officer," he says. Angela freezes. "Resisting? I have not resisted anything," she says. Jason steps forward, his phone still recording. "Officer, this does not look right. She is pregnant. She has not done anything to deserve this," he says. His voice is calm but firm. Marshall turns to Jason, his expression hard. "Stay back. This does not concern you," he snaps. But Jason does not move. "It concerns all of us when you are treating someone unfairly," he says. The tension in the air grows thicker. Angela takes a deep breath and says, "Officer, please let me call my husband." Marshall scoffs. "Your husband cannot save you now," he says with a sneer. Angela looks at him, her expression calm but determined. "You will regret this," she says softly. Her words hang in the air, adding to the tension. Just as Marshall is about to place her in the patrol car, another car pulls up. The sound of the engine catches everyone's attention. A man steps out of the sleek black vehicle, his presence commanding and undeniable. It is Angela's husband, David. He walks toward the scene with calm but purposeful strides. His tailored suit and confident demeanor immediately shift the atmosphere. Marshall looks at David, his expression faltering for the first time. "Who are you?" he asks, his voice less confident. David stops in front of Marshall and says, "I am David Williams. Angela is my wife, and I am her lawyer." His words are calm, but there is an undeniable authority in his tone. The crowd murmurs, realizing that the situation has taken a dramatic turn. Jason keeps his phone steady, capturing every moment. David looks at Angela, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asks. Angela nods, relief washing over her. "I am fine, but he has been harassing me for no reason," she says. David turns back to Marshall, his gaze sharp. "Officer, I hope you understand the gravity of your actions," he says. Marshall shifts uncomfortably, the confidence he had moments ago completely gone. The crowd watches in silence as David steps closer to Marshall. "You have wrongfully detained my wife, and you have violated her rights," he says firmly. Marshall opens his mouth to respond but says nothing. David pulls out his phone and dials a number. "I am calling the district supervisor right now," he says. Marshall's face pales as he realizes the situation is slipping out of his control. The crowd begins to cheer quietly, sensing that justice is finally within reach. Angela looks at her husband, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knows she is no longer alone in this fight. Marshall steps back, his hands trembling slightly. The power dynamic has shifted completely. Angela stands tall beside her husband, knowing that the truth is on her side. As the tension in the air grew heavier, David remained calm and composed. Angela, though shaken by the arrest, felt reassured by her husband's presence. The crowd's attention shifted entirely to him, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. David's first move was to address Officer Marshall directly. "Officer," he began, his voice firm yet measured, "I have already contacted the district attorney's office. What you have done today is not only unjust, but also unlawful. You have no grounds for this arrest." Marshall hesitated for a moment, the confidence draining from his face. He tried to maintain authority. "She was acting suspicious," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. David took a step closer. "Suspicious? My wife is 7 months pregnant, driving home from a routine checkup, and your actions are now being recorded by multiple witnesses. You are aware this video will hold up in court," he said, gesturing toward the onlookers holding their phones. Marshall's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The crowd, emboldened by David's presence, began to speak up. "Yeah, we all saw it," one man shouted. "She didn't do anything wrong." Another added, "You're abusing your power, officer." Angela, still handcuffed, stood silently, her strength rooted in her husband's unwavering resolve. Jason stepped forward, showing the video to David. "I captured everything," he said. David nodded and took the phone, reviewing the footage briefly. "This," David said, holding up the phone, "is undeniable proof of racial bias and abuse of power. Officer Marshall, I suggest you release my wife immediately and prepare for the consequences of your actions." Marshall looked around nervously. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Still, his pride and authority made him hesitate. Just then, another patrol car pulled up to the scene. Out stepped Sergeant Williams, a senior officer known for his integrity. The crowd shifted their focus, hopeful that justice would finally prevail. Sergeant Williams approached the scene, his eyes scanning the situation quickly. He saw Angela in handcuffs, her distressed state, and David standing tall, holding Jason's phone. "What is going on here?" Williams asked, his voice calm but commanding. David turned to him and said, "Sergeant, this officer has wrongfully detained my wife without cause. She is pregnant, and he has subjected her to unnecessary harassment and humiliation." Williams looked at Marshall, his expression unreadable. "Officer, is this true?" he asked. Marshall stammered, "I thought she was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job." Williams frowned. "Suspicious? Based on what evidence? Do you have any proof to support your actions?" he asked. Marshall fell silent, unable to justify his behavior. David stepped forward. "Sergeant, we have video evidence of everything that happened. The officer's actions were baseless and discriminatory. I demand that my wife be released immediately," he said. Williams nodded and turned to Marshall. "Release her," he ordered firmly. Marshall hesitated but ultimately complied, unlocking the handcuffs from Angela's wrists. As Angela rubbed her wrists, David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The crowd began to clap and cheer, their support for Angela and David clear. Sergeant Williams addressed the crowd. "Thank you for your patience. We will conduct a thorough investigation into this incident. I assure you, actions like this do not represent our department's values," he said. Marshall stepped back, his face pale and his posture defeated. He knew his career was now in jeopardy. The crowd continued to record and voice their approval of the outcome. David turned to the crowd and said, "Thank you all for standing with us. Your support means everything. Together, we can hold people accountable and ensure this does not happen again." Angela, though shaken, managed a small smile. She looked at Jason and said, "Thank you for being brave enough to record everything. You made a difference today." Jason nodded, feeling proud of his actions. He had played a crucial role in ensuring justice was served. The scene began to settle as people dispersed, their faith in justice partially restored. David and Angela walked to their car, hand in hand. Though the ordeal was traumatic, they knew they had made a stand that would resonate far beyond this moment. Sergeant Williams approached David before they left. "Mr. Williams, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. This should never have occurred. We will ensure this officer is held accountable," he said. David nodded, appreciating the sergeant's sincerity. "Thank you, Sergeant. I hope this serves as a wake-up call for the department. Change starts with accountability," he said. As David and Angela drove away, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Angela looked out of the window, her thoughts racing. She knew they had won a small victory, but the fight for justice and equality was far from over. David, sensing her unease, said, "Today, we took a stand. We showed that even in the face of injustice, we can fight back and make a difference." Angela nodded, her resolve strengthening. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "This is the world we are fighting to change. For our child, and for every child." The news of Angela's wrongful detention and David's stand against Officer Marshall spread rapidly. Videos from the scene were shared across social media, gathering thousands of views in a matter of hours. The story quickly caught the attention of local and national media. The video captured the unfair treatment of a pregnant black woman, igniting conversations about racial bias and police misconduct. The community was enraged. People from all walks of life began to voice their anger and demand accountability. Protests erupted outside the police station. People carried signs that read, "Justice for Angela," and "Stop Racism Now." Local leaders and activists joined the demonstrations, amplifying the call for justice. Angela's story resonated deeply with many who had faced similar discrimination. The protesters chanted, "No justice, no peace," their voices echoing through the streets. A powerful sense of unity began to build. David decided to address the public. Standing on the steps of the police station, he spoke with conviction. "This is not just about my wife. This is about every person who has been wronged by those who are supposed to protect us. We demand accountability. We demand change." His words struck a chord, and the crowd erupted in applause. The media intensified its coverage. Interviews with Angela, David, and eyewitnesses were broadcast on multiple channels. Angela, though initially reluctant to speak, shared her story. "I just wanted to get home safely, but instead, I was treated like a criminal. This cannot continue," she said, her voice steady but emotional. As the protests continued, more people came forward with their own stories of discrimination at the hands of Officer Marshall. A young man named Terrence spoke out during a community meeting. "He pulled me over last year for no reason. He searched my car and humiliated me in front of my friends. I never thought anyone would believe me until now." An elderly woman, Mrs. Carter, shared her experience. "He stopped me outside a grocery store and accused me of stealing. I was so scared. I had done nothing wrong." These stories painted a damning picture of a pattern of abuse and misconduct. The pressure on the police department mounted. The chief of police, aware of the public outcry, announced an internal investigation. "We take these allegations very seriously," he said in a press conference. Officer Marshall has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. While some viewed this as a step in the right direction, others were not satisfied. Protesters demanded more than just an investigation. They wanted systemic changes to prevent such incidents from happening again. Angela's story had become a symbol of a much larger issue. The protests grew larger with each passing day. People from neighboring towns joined in solidarity. Social media campaigns like Justice for Angela and Our End Police Bias began trending. Influential figures, including celebrities and politicians, lent their voices to the cause. David worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing meetings with community leaders and legal experts. He wanted to ensure that the momentum did not fade. "This is about more than just one officer," he said during a strategy session. "We need policies that hold everyone accountable." Meanwhile, Angela focused on her own healing. The overwhelming support from the community gave her strength. She began attending rallies and speaking out. "I never wanted to be in this position," she said at a large gathering. "But if sharing my story can bring about change, then I will continue to speak." The police department faced scrutiny like never before. Journalists uncovered previous complaints against Officer Marshall that had been ignored. Calls for a complete overhaul of the department grew louder. A petition demanding the dismissal of Marshall and reforms in the department garnered over 100,000 signatures. Even officers within the department began to voice their concerns. Some supported Angela's calls for accountability. Others, however, felt the pressure and struggled with the growing distrust from the community. At a town hall meeting, Sergeant Williams addressed the crowd. "What happened to Angela was wrong. We, as officers, need to do better. This is not who we should be." His admission was met with cautious applause. Angela's story reached national news networks. Prominent figures debated the incident, with some arguing for stricter oversight of law enforcement. Others defended the police, claiming the situation was being blown out of proportion. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing was clear: the community was demanding change. Schools began holding discussions about racial equality. Churches organized prayer meetings for justice. Local businesses put up signs supporting Angela and her family. David and Angela's story became a turning point for the town. It sparked a movement that went beyond one incident. People who had once stayed silent began to speak up. Young activists emerged, determined to fight for justice. The protests continued peacefully but with unwavering resolve. Each day, more people joined, their voices blending into a powerful call for change. Angela and David stood at the forefront, their courage inspiring others to take action. As the investigation into Officer Marshall unfolded, the evidence against him piled up. The video recordings, witness testimonies, and previous complaints painted a clear picture of misconduct. The pressure on the police department to act decisively was immense. Finally, after weeks of protests and investigations, the department announced its decision. Officer Marshall was terminated from his position. The chief of police promised reforms to rebuild trust with the community. The crowd erupted in cheers when the news was announced. Angela and David, standing among the protesters, felt a sense of relief, but they knew their work was not done. "This is just the beginning," David said. "We must keep fighting for justice," Angela nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. "We must ensure that no one else has to go through what we did. Together, we can create a better future," she said. The community's support never wavered. They stood with Angela and David, determined to turn this moment into a lasting movement for justice and equality. Angela and David stood together at the town's central square. The air was thick with anticipation as a crowd gathered for the press conference they had organized. Angela took a deep breath, her hand clutching David's for support. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This has been one of the hardest experiences of my life," Angela began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But through the pain, I have found strength, and through your support, I have found hope. This is not just about me. This is about everyone who has faced injustice and stayed silent. Today, I choose not to stay silent." The crowd erupted in applause. Angela shared her story not as a victim, but as someone who wanted to bring about change. She spoke about forgiveness. "Hate will not heal us," she said, "but accountability and change will. We must work together to build a society where justice is not just a word, but a reality for everyone." David followed, his voice strong and inspiring. "I stand here not just as Angela's husband, but as a father and a member of this community. We demand reforms, and we will not stop until we see them. But we also believe in redemption. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow." Angela and David announced the creation of a foundation named Hope for Equality. Its mission was to educate and advocate for racial equality, police accountability, and community unity. The foundation would organize workshops in schools and workplaces, promoting conversations about implicit bias and systemic discrimination. Meanwhile, the town began to reflect on its own actions and attitudes. Community leaders organized meetings to address underlying tensions. Churches and local organizations held open discussions about race, equality, and justice. Angela and David were often invited to speak, their presence becoming a symbol of unity and resilience. Even within the police department, changes were taking place. Officer Marshall, once arrogant and unrepentant, faced a turning point. After his dismissal, he was required to attend a series of mandatory racial sensitivity and de-escalation training sessions. For weeks, Marshall resisted the process, but as he listened to the stories of those who had suffered from prejudice, something began to shift. In one session, Marshall listened as a mother spoke about the fear she felt every time her teenage son left the house. "I worry he might be stopped by someone who sees him as a threat just because of his skin color," she said, her voice trembling. Marshall felt a pang of guilt, realizing how his actions had contributed to that fear. By the end of the training, Marshall requested a private meeting with Angela and David. It was a moment they had not expected. Sitting across from them, his once proud demeanor replaced with humility, Marshall apologized. "I was wrong," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I see that now. I want to make amends." Angela, though surprised, responded with grace. "Change starts with acknowledgement," she said, "but it does not end there. It is what you do next that matters." Marshall asked to volunteer with the Hope for Equality Foundation, offering to speak about his journey and the importance of confronting bias. Angela and David agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to show that redemption was possible. The foundation quickly gained momentum. Schools began integrating its programs into their curriculum. Students participated in role-playing exercises to understand the impact of discrimination and the power of empathy. Local businesses partnered with the foundation to provide funding and resources. The town saw visible changes. Community events celebrating diversity became a regular occurrence. People who once avoided conversations about race began to engage openly. The protests, once filled with anger, transformed into celebrations of progress and hope. Angela and David worked tirelessly. They traveled to neighboring towns, sharing their story and encouraging others to take action. Their foundation grew, attracting national attention. Prominent figures praised their efforts, and donations poured in to support their cause. One evening, Angela and David sat on their porch, reflecting on how far they had come. Angela looked at David, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I never thought something so painful could lead to something so powerful," she said. David nodded, taking her hand. "It is because we did not give up. We turned our pain into purpose." Their story inspired others to do the same. Communities across the country began implementing programs similar to Hope for Equality. People who had been silent about their own experiences found the courage to speak out. Angela and David's message was clear. Change was possible, but it required action and unity. Their foundation became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that even in the face of injustice, resilience and compassion could pave the way for a better future. As for Officer Marshall, his journey continued. He spoke at events organized by the Foundation, sharing his story of transformation. Though some were skeptical of his intentions, many appreciated his willingness to take responsibility and contribute to the cause. In the end, Angela and David's efforts did more than bring justice to their own situation. They sparked a movement that inspired change far beyond their town. They proved that even the darkest moments could lead to brighter days if met with courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in the power of unity. Their story served as a reminder that redemption was possible for those willing to confront their mistakes, and that justice could be achieved when a community stood together. The town of Everwood had changed. It was not perfect, but it was no longer silent. Angela and David had shown what resilience and courage could achieve. The incident that once divided the town had become a turning point. Conversations about race and equality were no longer whispered. They were loud and honest. Angela stood on the Foundation's stage once again. This time, the crowd was larger. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the park, holding signs that read, "Hope for Equality." Children sat on blankets in the grass. Parents held their hands. Police officers stood at the edges, not as enforcers, but as participants. Angela spoke softly, but firmly. Her voice carried the weight of her journey and the hope for the future. "This is not the end of the road," she said. "This is just the beginning. We have proven that change is possible, but the work is not done. It is never done. We must continue to hold ourselves and each other accountable." The crowd cheered. Many had tears in their eyes. David stood beside Angela, his arm around her. He whispered, "You are incredible." She smiled, looking at the sea of faces that had come together. The Foundation's programs were now in full swing. Schools taught lessons on empathy and inclusion. Businesses offered diversity training to their employees. The police department partnered with the Foundation to create better policies. These changes were not easy, but they were happening, and they were making a difference. Even Officer Marshall had joined the movement. His transformation surprised many, but his honesty about his mistakes and commitment to growth inspired others. He spoke at events, sharing how he had learned from his actions. Marshall's presence showed that change was not just for victims. It was for everyone. Angela and David had faced challenges, but they had also found strength in their community. They had learned that unity was powerful, that one voice could spark many, and that even in the darkest times, hope could shine through. Angela closed her speech with a call to action. "What will you do?" she asked. Will you stand by when you see injustice, or will you stand up and make a difference? We have the power to create a better world. Together, the crowd erupted in applause. People began to chant, "Hope for equality." Angela stepped back from the microphone. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the crowd. This was more than she had ever dreamed. As the event ended, Angela and David stayed behind to speak with attendees. A young girl approached Angela, holding her mother's hand. She looked up and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Angela knelt down, smiling. "You already are," she said. The couple walked home that evening, hand in hand. The streets felt different, lighter, more hopeful. Angela looked up at the stars and whispered, "We did it." David squeezed her hand. "No," he said. "We started it, and we will keep going." Their story became a symbol of resilience. It showed that one act of courage could change lives, that even in the face of hate, love, and unity could prevail. Angela and David's journey was not just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had ever faced injustice, and to everyone who had ever fought to make things right. Their legacy would live on as a reminder that change was possible. No matter how hard the road, no matter how great the challenge, together, we can make a difference. What would you do if you were in Angela's place? Would you have the courage to stand up for what is right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And do not forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this.